Thanks for tuning in. Anybody have a transactional question, on something they're working on that they want to address before I get into the topics I've got for the day? Kendra, are you unmuting? Okay. It doesn't look like it, so we'll start with what I've got on my plate. Let me pull up the RPA. What happened there? Hold on just a second. Can't see this here. That didn't share very well. There we are. Let me try it again. All right. Now I've lost you all. There you are. So hold on just 1 second. Technical problems here. Come on now. All right. This is exciting, isn't it? Okay. Can you see the disclosure regarding agency relationship? Someone said,
Yes.
okay, great. So this is the RPA package, and starts with the disclosure, of course, and fair housing, and possible representation, wire fraud, and then we get into the RPA. And we've got our agency confirmation part, we've got our description of the property and the parties, we've got the agency confirmation part, and then we have the terms of the purchase and allocation of cost, which is paragraph 3, the grid, as we call it. So we had questions come up this week about the grid, and we were dealing with a pretty standard purchase agreement. There was a purchase price, there was about a 50% down payment, and then the buyer wanted the seller to carry a first loan for a period of a year for 50% of the purchase. So let's just say we were at a $500,000 purchase price. The initial deposit was going to be $15,000. That's 3% of the purchase price, which would be a good number for liquidated damages, so we don't have any increased deposit. If I'm using terms you don't understand, it's okay. We can, we'd have that on a coaching session offline. And so then the additional amount, so we didn't want to put anything in his loan amounts here because this is not a conventional loan. What we've got is under E2 here, we have additional financing, and we got 150, or what do we say, 250,000. 50%, 250,000 here. Whoops, sorry. And this is calculates down at the bottom. As you can see, it also calculates that the remainder due at close of escrow is 235 or total purchase price of 500. So it all balances out. That's good. But what we've got here is when we go over on this right-hand side in paragraph 3E2, we check seller financing. And that will trigger the uploading of what we call the SFA, the seller financing addendum. So let's go back in our forms here. Okay, there's my slider. And let's see, why can't I go? Oh, I know, this is back. There we go. We're going to go to the SFA. Okay. Can you see the seller financing addendum and disclosure?
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right, so this is one of the most complicated forms in our repertoire. All right. If you've never done one, our legal counsel actually discourages us from doing these, though it's always been traditional that the buyer's agent is responsible for creating this document at the time they create the offer. Because I'll get to it down further in the form, but they are what's called the arranger. I'll do it now. Down here on the last page above the buyer's signature and the seller's signature, there's the arranger of credit, and that's you or me, you know. So we're called the arranger of credit here. And what our attorneys don't like is that, we're doing, arranging credit. But there, the alternative is to tell the buyer, well, you got to have your attorney fill this out. Well, most buyers aren't going to have an attorney. So I'm okay, resisting our legal counsel's advice in this particular case, as long as you run this form by me or your manager prior to using it. Because like I say, it's one of the most complicated forms in our that we use on occasion. And we don't use it very often, but we use it on occasion. So you can see there's lots of check boxes and lots of blanks, more check boxes than usual here under paragraph 4 or 5, balloon payment. Maybe you've never heard of a balloon payment. Prepayment terms due on sale. These aren't every day. You probably covered some of these in your training to get a license or in your renewal, but it's not every day we get into these. Do we need a tax service? And so forth. Is there negative amortization or deferred interest? And is it covered by an all-inclusive deed of trust? The standard form calls for this to be credit documents under 3 here, paragraph 3. The credit time is of the essence. The time, this extension of credit by the seller will be evidenced by, and it's typically the note and deed of trust, but it could be an all-inclusive note or an installment land sale contract. It could be a lease option. There's multiple things here to consider. So if there's a senior loan, then you got to fill all this stuff out. Usually we don't see many all-inclusive deed of trust anymore. And then there's some information about the buyer's creditworthiness, some cautionary language. We get to sign this as the arranger of credit, and then the buyer and seller sign it. And there's this big block of, we don't provide legal advice. You should go see this. You run this by a lawyer. You know, it's just has financial ramifications for all parties and blah, blah, blah. So it's a complicated form. If you have occasion to negotiate a seller carryback, as it may be called, or seller financing, please run it by me or your manager so that we are comfortable with the form. Okay, any questions on that? Okay. All right, then let's go back to the RPA. And by the way, the RPA comes up with that little folder, which it covers is actually pretty handy. It has an explanation of every paragraph in the RPA. So it's a good tutoring thing if you want to do a little self-tutorial on some of the language in the RPA. All right, so the second thing that came up was in the grid here under 3G3. You know, we're getting questions about whether this box should be checked. It says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under separate CAR form SPBB attached. Seller's broker offer, if any, to compensate the buyer's broker is unaffected unless otherwise agreed. All right. So you will use this and check this box only if you have an SPBB with your buyer. No, I'm sorry. The SPBP is about the seller's broker paying the buyer's obligation, but you use this form only if you have the buyer broker agreement, the BRBC. And that's what we're going to have a webinar on Monday. So I know I've reminded you many times, but if you haven't registered for that, I send out the registration and register for the webinar on Monday because it's going to cover the buyer broker agreement, representation agreement. So if we have a buyer broker representation agreement, then you would check this box and attach an SPBB. If you don't have one, then we don't check the box and we just carry on. So that's the story on that paragraph, G3. I'll stop sharing for a minute. Any questions on that? Okay.
Garrett, I don't exactly have a question on that, but you mentioned the other day regarding all this with the buyers asking for, you know, money, etc. For this whole thing. That you mentioned something about the seller advisory. Are you talking about just a standard seller advisory that comes with the RPA, or are you talking about something else?
No, this is an in-house advisory that your transaction coordinator will supply and have your client sign if you authorize them to do that. Let me see if I can pull that up. Just a second. All right, I'm gonna go over here. And these are new forms. And I saw Chris on here, so Chris would be one of the folks who would send you this. And I'm just gonna pull up the seller advisory for now. And let's share that. All right. Can you see the seller advisory here?
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So this isn't a disclosure, it's an advisory, but it's a seller advisory regarding real estate broker compensation in the sale of property. This used to say real property, but we took the word real out because we wanted it to be available for all our properties, including mobile homes and manufactured homes, which are not real property. So now we can still use the same form, and it's just for either real property or personal property.
So
one of
this,
these for a seller and one of them for a buyer, and we'll be using these in each of our transactions now.
okay, so for all listings, we should be providing that for the seller?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
all right, thank you.
I will send it around again with the recording, but your GC will also know that it needs to be part of our package. Okay. Great. Thank you for that. Let me go get a couple things more here. Oops. Okay, I'm going to go back to the RPA. And can we see the RPA again? In the grid?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I don't know what you guys are seeing. I just know what I'm seeing. And sometimes I'm not so dexterous on this thing. Okay, so now we're looking at paragraph 3L8, which is down here, the sale of the buyer's property. So this is when you're writing an offer for a buyer and the buyer has to sell a property, either their home or an investment property, it doesn't really matter, but they have to sell another property in order to buy this property, and they want it to be contingent, this contract to be contingent on the sale of that property, otherwise they can't buy it. So if that's the case, you check this box here, and it says CAR form COP attached. So the COP, sorry, where to go here? Oh, darn, somehow I closed my ZipForms. So let me go back and open my ZipForms. I'm sorry. I'm just reopening my ZipForms. Sorry for the delay. I accidentally closed it. All right, so we're going to go look at the COP. And this is another complicated form. So I'm covering two of our more complicated forms today. Okay. Back to you all. Okay. I'm going to share screen and share this. All right. Can you see the COP form? Someone?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So this is the form that pops up and you got to fill it out. So it'll autofill, obviously, all this buyer seller information, which you've already entered into the RPA. And then there's, again, a number of options here. So the 1A is the buyer is entering into contract for the sale of and closing on the buyer's property. And then you would skip to paragraphs 2 and 4. Or B, it's contingent upon only upon entering into the contract for the sale of the buyer's property. And or C, which is it's contingent upon only the close of the buyer's property. And this would be where the buyer's already in escrow and you have an escrow number that you would fill in there and so forth and so on. So the typical is going to be the default 1A that you haven't yet entered into a contract. So it's contingent upon the buyer entering into the contract for the sale of and closing escrow on the buyer's property. And then you would skip to 2. So the buyer entering into a contract. So the default is the buyer shall have 17 days. We had a case where the buyer wasn't going to put the property on the market until May 1st, which I don't know, is 45 days. So you can ask for that if you want. I don't know if the seller is willing to wait that long. But you know, you can put in an alternative number of days there, but the default is 17 days. And then if we're using the default 1A, we skipped 4, and then the close of escrow on the property as of 1A. So now if the property is already listed, then you would fill out this paragraph 3 that they've signed a listing agreement. You put in the brokerage name. Hopefully it's you. But it may be an out of area property. So maybe they're selling a property in Los Angeles and they have listed with some brokerage down there. So you need to get that information. Or B, the buyer's property is or will be submitted to the MLS. Or the check here if the buyer is not going to submit it to the MLS and so forth and so on. This property really gets complicated in this paragraph 7 about backup offers and the seller's right to require buyer to remove this contingency or cancel. So the 7A says the seller can accept backup offers. Okay, that's all well and good. All right, and then 7B talks about the removal of the buyer contingencies and proof of funds. And it says, if the seller accepts a written backup offer and provides the buyer a copy of that accepted backup offer, and within the specified period of time, and 7C1, which is below. So let's go to 7C1 because it's referencing that. So the time to give notice to remove contingency. Seller shall have the right to invoke the notice provisions in 7B, and the default is immediate right to notify the buyer at any time after acceptance. So that means that the seller gets a backup offer, they ratify that, and so they give our buyer a notice to perform basically, or gives them notice that they have a backup offer, and they notify the buyer that, hey, you remove your contingency now. 7C2 is a delayed right to notify. So that way, if you check that box, then the seller can't, even though they might accept a backup offer, they can't do so for 17 days. That's usually a reasonable number for the buyer to get themselves into escrow. Most buyers and sellers might go along with the 17 days and say, okay, well, give us a chance to sell our property and, you know, so forth and so on. It's all negotiable. And then 7.3 is the most liberal or helpful to the buyer, but the worst one for the seller. And that means the seller has no right to notify the buyer. And then the seller should, you know, so basically they can't accept a backup offer unless the buyer cancels. Okay, so that's all has to do with 7C, going back to 7B. And it talks about how they remove the contingency, how, they have 2 days after delivery of the notice to remove the contingency and so forth and so on. So the last part of this one is interesting. It's under this paragraph 11. And this has to do with making deposits and starting the inspection period on the buyer's property that they want to buy. So the default is the time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingency, close of escrows, and this shall begin as specified in the agreement. So this agreement, the RPA, the default is 17 days to remove your contingencies for inspection. So the default here is that the buyer, even though they have this contingency to sell their home, is going to go ahead and do their due diligence and inspections on the property they're trying to buy immediately. This box allows the delay of that on the day that the buyer delivers the seller the following: escrow evidence for the buyer's property or buyer's election in writing to begin the time periods. So this delays that need for the buyer to start due diligence on their inspections and so forth until they get an offer, accepted offer on the house they're trying to sell. So that protects the buyer from having to spend money on termite reports and home inspections and other things until they get an offer on their purchase on the property they're trying to sell. Same with the deposit. The default is that the deposit would go in immediately, or if you check that box, it would go in within 3 days after the buyer delivers to the buyer the escrow evidence for the buyer's property. So again, there's a lot of choices that are kind of complicated in that form that it's really good to go over it carefully and review it with me or your manager if you're using the COP form. Any questions on that? Okay. I think in a normal market, we've been in a kind of a strong seller's market for a good number of years now, probably 10 or 12 years. And we haven't seen many contingency offers, but some of us who have been in the business a while longer than 10 or 12 years, you know who you are, remember days where it wasn't unusual that maybe 25% of our sales would have, be contingent sales, with a buyer needing to sell property in order to buy their next property. And remember, there's the reverse form of the COP, which is, I forget what it's called, COPS maybe it is, but that's contingent on the seller finding replacement property. So sometimes we have the buyer who wants to sell a home, but sometimes we have a seller who says, well, I'll sell the home, but I don't want to sell the home until I find the new home. So there's a reverse form, which has very similar terms to it as the COP. It's just for the seller to find replacement property. So is in a more balanced market, we would see both of those options being used. Okay. The question came up about, we got an offer on a property, and the seller didn't want to accept the property, didn't even want to respond to the property. Now, our job as listing agents is to, assist the seller in getting what they want. And one of the ways they do that often is by negotiating. They get an offer that doesn't have the price or terms that they want. We would encourage, what I say is encourage them to counter. Even if they're going to counter at full price, write a counter offer. But sometimes the sellers kind of gets an offer, they're insulted, they take it personally, whatever reason, then they say, no, I'm not even going to consider that offer. It's bogus. So they're going to not respond to it. So the question came up, well, there's this place down here on the form. Where we can confirm that we presented the offer. And the agent can initial this or the seller. And this just confirms that we presented the offer. Okay, this isn't legally binding in any way. It's just if let's say you have a seller who or a buyer's agent say, well, I want to make sure you presented the offer. And you say, okay, and then you have the seller initial that it was presented on such and such date. And then there's this box up here above that. It says the offer is not accepted. No counter offer is being made. This offer was not accepted by the seller on this and this date. Again, this isn't legally binding and it's not required. You could just verbally tell the buyer's agent, hey, we are, the seller's not going to respond. Oh, I almost used the we word. Oh, no. The seller's not going to respond to your buyer's offer. And, write a new one if you want to. But it's not a bad idea to get your seller to initial this. I mean, if nothing else, it gets them used to signing the document, right? And everything is a step, so it's a little step, and then you can send this back to the buyer's agent and say, okay, here it is. The offer was presented. The seller doesn't want to counter it, and here's his initials saying so. Okay. So has anyone used that form in the past? Signed those parts? Yeah. I think it's a good practice. It's there for a reason. It's not legally binding, but it's a good practice to go through those steps. It's good
I
practice.
also had a buyer's agent who requested that I
Yeah.
have my seller initial
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And I think it's just a good standard of practice to go through that step and do that. And sometimes you have multiple offers and your sellers wants to work with 2 out of 5 offers, say. Well, you're gonna be signing lots of papers anyway, multiple counteroffer forms and this and that. You might as well have them sign this part on the 3 offers they aren't going to accept. And then you can send them back to those buyers agents and say, hey, there were multiple offers and they decided not to work with 2 of them, but not these. So we're sending it back to you. Okay, any questions on that? All right. Couple other questions came up this week. One was about water rights, and I think the way the question was worded to me was, I'm going to be listing, this is from one of our agents, I'm going to be listing a vacant piece of land. Is the seller entitled to the water from 2 springs on the property? Like she's asking me, right? Would I know the answer to that? Not really. I mean, anything I'd say would be a guess because I don't know what the legal riparian rights are, or the rights to the spring, or maybe they've been deeded away to a neighbor. We did a property once, actually. A neighbor was short on water, and the neighboring property had lots of water. So we negotiated a water easement between the 2 parties, and the neighbor that needed the water had legal rights to take water from his neighbor's property. And built a little system to convey the water from, I think it was a spring or a well, I can't remember which. And the water went through some pipes over to the neighbor's property, and that was there. So when that seller went to sell the property, and he had assigned away some of those water rights, he had forgotten about that. And when we got a prelim on the property and it said the the neighbor had rights to the water, the new buyer for the seller's property said, well, I don't like that. You know, I don't want to buy your property. And then the seller got angry for us because we had helped negotiate this water easement for the neighbor. And you know, he forgot all about the fact that he got paid for it, and you know, he did it willingly. But you know, he wanted to blame someone for him not being able to sell his property. Now, he could sell his property. It was just that particular buyer didn't like that particular provision. And in fact, we went to the neighbor who had the rights to the water and say, hey, would you give that up? You know, so we'll pay you money to give that up. And he said, no, I have no other source of water. So, you know, it didn't go anywhere. So water is a touchy issue. So what did I say to our agent? I said, work, you know, hopefully on your team, we all have a team of our favorite lender and our favorite, hopefully it's a Pinnacle Home Loans lender, you know, because they're our buddies. We have our favorite escrow officer. We have our favorite insurance person. We have our favorite home warranty person. We have our favorite NHD person. You know, we have this team of other professionals that help us in this business. And so I said, call the escrow officer that's on your team and ask if you can get a prelim on it and see if there's any conveyance of that water to any other party. The water from the spring. And then, you know, so that will tell you if there's anything recorded about that. And then ask the title officer, once you get the prelim and there's nothing showing up there, that if they have an opinion about the a buyer's or an owner's use of that water that comes from the springs, and they might refer you to someone at the county or the city or wherever you are, the jurisdiction that's responsible for that area, to get their view of it. But it's not an area of expertise that we have to determine whether an owner is entitled to water from a spring that's on the property. Yeah, Yvonne?
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute.
Yeah.
When the original rights to the water was set up, couldn't, if the owner of the water, couldn't it have been set up in a way that it was only good for as long as he held the property?
Yeah, anything could have been negotiated.
Yeah, so he
Yeah.
could have set it up so it was
If he conveyed the property, then those water rights
right,
would go away.
right.
But the neighbor who was paying for the easement, and they did pay money for it.
Yeah,
And the seller was more than happy to accept the money at the time.
right.
But and it was a negotiated amount, you know.
Sure.
So in that particular instance, the buyer of the water rights, you know, didn't want to agree to anything like that, and maybe the seller didn't ask for that.
Right.
It really there was enough water being generated at this time from the well to service both properties,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for normal usage. But the buyer was concerned that, you know, there's reports of water table lower, you know, dropping, you know, what if the well went dry because this neighbor was overusing it? Who was responsible to deepen the well if it needed deepening, or, you know, I think there was actually, we didn't draw this easement agreement. It was a, you know, multi-page agreement prepared by attorneys who specialized in riparian rights.
Yeah.
So there was language in it about maintaining the well, replacing the well,
Hmm.
having to make modifications to wells, so how those costs would be shared down the road if that had to happen. It was a very complete agreement, but it did not say anything about the water rights going away if the seller sold the property.
Right. Well, since you said that the one who got the rights didn't have it water any other way, sounds
Yeah, I
like
mean,
it's a yes or nothing.
well, yeah, we had clients that also on a country property at one time, their wells were tainted with boron, I think it was,
Mm,
and it wasn't potable. So they could use, or potable, I don't forget what the word is, potable or potable. And so they couldn't use it for household use. They could use it in the swimming pool. They could use it for irrigation, though boron killed certain things. But it wasn't good for drinking and taking their showers and stuff like that. So they had to bring in truck-in water for those purposes. So every month or so, they'd get one of those big water trucks come in, and it would empty it into um, a tank that they had on the property, and they'd use that for their household use. So there's other options, but in determining the price that neighbor was willing to pay for the water rights, he said, well, my alternative is to truck water up here, and that costs me this, so I'll offer you this, so
mm,
it was a negotiation.
yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so if you get a question on water rights, claim the fifth. I was watching a show last night, and this person's being interrogated, and they said, "No comment." And the person telling the story said, "Well, that wasn't even a question." Yeah. So anyway, say no comment. But we want to be helpful, so direct them to your title officer. And remember, you have a favorite escrow officer who you don't really probably know is the title officer who works behind the escrow officer at the title company. So the escrow officer is the one we do face-to-face work with, and they do all the paperwork and, send us the forms and prepare the closing statements and take the checks and, make sure everything balances out and all that. They're kind of accountants almost. Behind them for the insurance company, because it is an insurance company, it's a title insurance company, is what's called a title officer. And the title officer is the one who looks over the prelim and it tells the people that, okay, this is a property we'll insure the title of, because they've looked at the chain of title and the easements and this and that. And of course,
What element of life has yet to be
when you
discovered?
look at your prelim,
Able to speculate.
oops, I'm just going to mute Kendra there. When you look at your prelim, there's exclusions, and then the insurance company puts those in because we aren't going to insure over the particular issue. And sometimes there's more exclusions than other times. If you haven't had an orientation to reading a prelim, let me know and I'll arrange for one of our friendly title representatives to do a little class and get us an orientation, give us an orientation to how to read a prelim. But anyway, the title officer, they're usually their name and phone number is on the first page of the prelim. And if you have a title question, the escrow officer is going to just turn it over to the title officer anyway. So you just call the title officer direct. Okay. Two more things. Forms from other brokerages. I know we handle this from time to time. Sometimes another broker will have the custom form and they'll send us and they want it signed, and our agent calls and said, does my client have to sign this? And usually it's no, they don't have to. Have they looked at it and is there a reason they don't want to sign it? And usually they haven't looked at it because our agent hasn't sent it to them yet. But yeah, I said, well, send it to them and see if they're willing to sign it. I don't, I'll look at the form. I said, I don't see any problem with it, but there's no requirement they sign it. The other company wants it. If they're willing to sign it, fine. If they aren't, we'll just tell the other company no. But what we had a while back was a person, an heir handling the sale of an estate for a trust. So they were an exempt seller. And the buyer's TC, the buyer's agent's TC wanted all these forms signed that an exempt seller doesn't have to sign. And the exempt seller happened to be an attorney. And they said, no, I don't want to sign any of those forms. So they passed it up to the buyer's agent's broker, who called us and said, hey, we need all these forms. And we said, well, you don't need all those forms because our seller's not going to sign them. And well, he doesn't want to sign them. And we'll give you the emails where we send them to him. And he sent it back and says, you're not going to sign them. And you'll just have to live with that. And that's kind of what ended up happening. So if you get a request from the other side, and it's not a normal form, or it's a form that an exempt seller, and our client's an exempt seller and they don't have to sign, they don't want to sign it, then we just tell the other side no. That's how it goes. One more thing, and then any questions or answers, or questions. Let me see, I think I reduced this thing, so hold on just a minute. I'll pull it up. Okay. All right, some of us were in Santa Rosa sales meeting yesterday, and some of you were online and some of you were there in person, but Steve Gwenza, I don't even know how to pronounce Steve's name. Gwenza. He's an experienced agent, a senior mortgage advisor with Pinnacle Home Loans, and he was at the meeting. And you remember a little while ago, Cal Haffa had a program called Cal Haffa Dream, and it was for new home buyers. And they've got another $150 million or something allocated for this program. And the last one went very quickly. All the money was taken up like in 3 days or something. And this time there was such a demand for it. They have some kind of allocation system, which is more like a lottery. So if you have a qualified buyer and wants to take advantage of this program, they need to be pre-qualified by a lender. And again, Steve or another Pinnacle loan officer or your loan officer du jour can help pre-qualify them. And then they send a form off to the Cal Haffa and they go into the lottery. We don't know exactly how the lottery is going to work, because that's a limited amount of money for, they think they'll provide about 1,700 loans across the whole state for new home buyers. But this form kind of talks about how the program works. It provides up to 20% down for down payment and closing costs. It only needs to be paid back when the property is sold or refinanced with no monthly payments. And the payment amount is the original loan plus 20% of the equity granted gained when the property is sold. So, and then there's a little example of how that works. So there's no monthly payment on the loan amount. And it doesn't have to be counted against the buyer's qualifications. And it's you know, it's an interesting program. Now, there are these eligibility requirements, okay? Each of the borrowers must be first-time home buyers, and at least one of the borrowers must be a first-generation home buyer. So this is kind of a interesting thing. It's that's defined as a home buyer who has not been on title, held an ownership interest in a home, or been named in a mortgage in the U.S. in the last 7 years, and their parents do not currently have any present home ownership, or if the parents are deceased, did not have home ownership at the time of death. Wow, you know, who's going to check that out? But so it's interesting. That's a pretty restrictive qualification. So you're a couple, and you know, my parents own a home, but your parents are renters. So only one of the borrowers needs to be a first generation home buyer. So you would be a first generation home buyer, and that would allow the two of us to qualify for this home loan. And so I thought of a scenario where I know someone that would qualify for that. So there are people, but it is a pretty big restriction. They have to be owner occupied and no co-signers. And the income limits apply per county. In Sonoma County, we was a Sonoma meeting, so they put in the Sonoma number was $202,000 a year for the applicants, the first-time homebuyers. So that's a pretty generous amount. In Lake and Mendo, I think it was in the 140s, I want to say, or something like that. And I don't know what it was in Eureka, but if you call one of your, our local Pinnacle people, they'll know the income limits for your area. And then there's benefits and so forth. So this is an interesting program. April 1st is the deadline for getting your buyer pre-qualified and ready to use that program. So you could build a little marketing campaign about it, to first-time home buyers. Send out postcards, call everybody you know. Hey, there's this program for first-time home buyers. You know anybody? Yeah, so it's a good touch point for your SOI. You could send them that flyer. Yeah, 250 million, Sharon says, was the amount that's available in that program. Okay, thank you. But it still was about, I think they said 1,700 loans, they thought. Okay. I will send that form, that flyer along with the recording, if you want to look at it. I also I sent for the last time this morning the registration for Monday's webinar. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I had one going back to the seller advisory regarding the compensation. Since that's not a CAR form, how do we access it if we want to?
Our TCs have it.
Okay.
I will attach both. I have sent it out previously. I will attach it again and send it out
Thank you. Okay.
along with the recording. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Parmita?
Just as a reminder, I don't know if you.
Oops, sorry. I accidentally muted you.
No worries.
I was trying to lower your hand.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Many people have tried muting me, Gary.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Yeah.
Just as a reminder, I asked Steve yesterday, and he said we have permission to go out and send out that flyer that he created via social media.
Yeah.
So I sent it to a few people via email yesterday, and the response has been good so far.
Oh, great. Yeah. Good to hear. Well done. Okay. I think that's all on my form, unless there's any other questions. See, what time do we have? Well, 11:58, we're right on time. All right, well, I think the rain has stopped for a little bit. I see blue sky here, so I don't know how it's up in Eureka. Jennifer, it's a broken out there?
It actually was sunny this morning. In the middle of the meeting, it started raining.
Aha.
Now it stopped.
Okay. All right. Well, it's that time of year where we get passing storms and thunderstorms and so forth. So anyway, thanks, thank you all, and enjoy the weekend, and we'll catch up with you next week. We'll see you on Monday's webinar. I probably won't do a class on Friday because we'll all be doing Monday's webinar. So we'll see you the week after. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.